Hello and welcome to the channel True Crime Night Tales. This case is very tough and please, if you don't have strong nerves, don't listen to it. It disturbed me a lot. This incident occurred in France. The main character of this story is named Lydia Guado. She was born on November 13th, 1962, in a town called Maisons-Alfort in the Val-de-Marne department, which is 9 kilometers from Paris. To begin this story, we need to travel back in time. Lydia's future parents, Raymond Guado and his bride Jacqueline, married in 1956. In the early years of their marriage, they had 2 children, a boy named Bruno and his sister Nadia. At first glance, the newly formed family seemed normal in every way. However, sometime after Nadia's birth, their father Raymond was tried for armed robbery and sentenced to 5 years in prison. While the man was in prison, his wife Jacqueline started a passionate affair with a certain man, which resulted in her becoming pregnant. During one of the allowed visits, Jacqueline informed her husband of this and made it clear that the child was not his. Nevertheless, Raymond reacted understandingly to the information he heard and expressed his willingness to recognize the child, who was born out of his wife's extramarital affair. Soon, a girl was born and baptized Lydia Guado. A few years later, the man was released and almost immediately broke off official relations with his wife Jacqueline, who was left alone with 3 children. Apparently, the woman did not have much love for her offspring, so she decided to give them to a social organization, which soon placed them in a foster family. According to the available data, the children were lucky and ended up in a family that not only loved them as their own, but also gave them everything they needed for a new beginning. Despite Bruno's support, the eldest child always hoped that his biological parents would come for him and his sisters. Moreover, he even gave his sisters hope that this would happen one day. While still in prison, Raymond saw an ad in the dating section of a newspaper from a certain woman named Lucienne and responded to it. Soon, a correspondence began between him and Lucienne. When Raymond was released, he found this woman and married her. Shortly after the marriage, the idea occurred to him that he must get his children back by any means. So one night, the man, armed, broke into the house of the family who had his children. Hearing the noise in the house's first floor, the girls were terrified. Nadia couldn't remember what her father looked like, and Lydia didn't know the man at all. They thought it was none other than an ogre coming to eat them because they hadn't fallen asleep in time. Despite the resistance of the foster family, who threatened to call the police, Raymond managed to take the children from the foster family and put them in his car. There are no indications that this man's actions had legal consequences for him. Perhaps the representatives of the foster family were simply afraid of Raymond and did not report the abduction to the police. After several hours on the road, the man brought his children to his home, where he introduced them to Lucienne and said she was their new mother, meaning they had to obey her. Apparently, the first years of their life together were relatively calm, at least judging by the family photos taken during this time. The family moved to a new house in a quiet and cozy place. Raymond received welfare payments and simultaneously started his own business, offering instant printing of cards for all occasions and various office supplies. Lucienne also occasionally worked in her husband's business, but was mainly involved in office activities. Over time, the family's life began to change dramatically. The somewhat older children were cruelly treated and physically assaulted by their father and stepmother. The first thing Lydia remembered from that time was how Raymond beat her brother Bruno for playing with a neighbor's child. When the Guado couple went to work, they hired young girls to take care of the children. When Raymond returned home, he forced these girls to drink alcohol with him. Once, the man even tried to persuade one of the girls to be intimate with him, but she managed to escape. Later, the father of the hired girl came to the house to confront Raymond and injured him severely. After that, the man no longer hired babysitters. Sometime after this incident, Raymond bought a caravan to take his family on vacation to the sea. Upon arrival, the Guado family members spent time on the beach and swam in the water like other vacationers. However, something else happened that went beyond normal behavior. When Raymond was in the water, he approached his daughter Nadia and pressed her unnaturally close to his body. The girl tried to free herself from her father's embrace, but this only provoked him further. From that moment on, Nadia became the object of Raymond's perverse desires. Lydia remembered that one day she heard her sisters crying and pleading from the caravan, and that's when it all began. Raymond committed his first sexual offense against one of his daughters. Since then, regular beatings and even more horrific actions by the Guado spouses towards the children became the norm. Bruno and Nadia stopped attending elementary school, while Lydia didn't even know what it was. She was treated in the cruelest manner, possibly because she was not Raymond's biological daughter. A few years later, around 1971, when Lydia was just 8 years old, the real bullying began. The first documented health damage was caused by Lucienne, apparently because Lydia had gotten very dirty while playing outside. In response, the stepmother placed the girl in a bath with boiling water and bleach. Lydia later recalled that her delicate baby skin immediately peeled off and floated to the surface of the water. When Raymond heard the girl's screams, he ran into the bathroom, pulled Lydia out of the water, and laid her on the bed, trying to apply vegetable oil to the burns. However, he soon realized how severe the wounds were and had to take the girl to the hospital. Later, it was determined that Lydia had suffered third-degree burns. To avoid taking responsibility for his wife's actions, Raymond blamed the city administration, claiming they had supplied excessively hot water to the faucet. In the meantime, the girl was first placed in intensive care and then in the burn unit of the city of Lyon, where she stayed for several months. Lydia had to undergo several skin grafts. Raymond was always by her side, not because he was a good father, but to ensure the girl couldn't reveal what had really happened. Eventually, the man grew tired of the hospital stay and said he would take his daughter home to continue her treatment there. The specialists dealing with Lydia's health opposed this decision, but Raymond enlisted the support of their family doctor, who issued a certificate stating he would personally continue treating the child. Raymond then carried Lydia out of the burn unit. At home, the man indeed began treating the girl. He bathed her, regularly changed her bandages, and simultaneously started touching her. One day, Raymond came home with a camera and said he needed to take some pictures for the insurance company. First, he took a photo of Lydia, asking her to smile, and then took several photos of her intimate areas. Sometime later, Raymond approached his youngest daughter again and told her that their family doctor had prescribed her ether to inhale. Consequently, the man forced the child to inhale it. Afterward, the girl was in a semi-conscious state, aware that her father was doing something strange and painful to her at that moment. This marked Raymond's first crime against Lydia's sexual integrity. During this time, Raymond's wife stood by and not only did not stop him, but actively encouraged him. The girl, almost 9 years old, began to view what was happening as normal, thinking that her father loved her, and therefore there was nothing wrong with his actions. Years later, she explained in an interview with a French TV show how her father justified his terrible deeds. According to her, he told his children that he did this to make them feel good. He argued, among other things, that as a father, he had every right to do so. In 1975, the Guado family moved to the village of Conchy-sur-Gondoire in the Seine-et-Marne department, about 40 kilometers from Paris. At their new location, the abuse of the children by the couple continued. Moreover, the teenagers still did not attend school and had practically no contact with the outside world. After returning to work, Raymond obtained permission to park his caravan in the parking lot of a shopping center. To draw attention to his business, he placed photos of Lydia's burned legs on the vehicle, along with posters claiming that the girl had been burned due to the authorities' fault and had yet to receive compensation. This way, he created the impression of a father seeking public attention and justice. When he felt the photos alone were insufficient, he forced Lydia to accompany him and publicly displayed her horrific scars. He then exploited the sympathy of passers-by to sell his goods and fill his pockets with money. The first person to decide to end the bullying of Raymond and his wife was Bruno. Once, he and his sisters had already tried to escape, but were soon caught and punished. After this unsuccessful attempt, the 15-year-old boy, who had endured many years of physical assaults, managed to flee. Reports indicate that the young man approached the police and informed them about the situation at his parents' house. However, the government officials did not understand what they heard and simply placed the teenager in another foster family. Meanwhile, his sisters continued to suffer from their father's inclinations. As the girls grew older, their breasts began to develop. When Raymond noticed this, he started binding their chests tightly with elastic bandages, making it difficult for his daughters to breathe. The bandages themselves eventually turned into stinking rags because Raymond forbade removing them for months. He did not want anyone but himself to care for his daughters. Several years later, Bruno reappeared. The mature young man returned for his sister Nadia, who had already reached adulthood by that time. In the end, he was able to rescue her, while Lydia was still in danger. Her room had become the dark and damp attic of the house, where Raymond, without any fear, indulged all his perverse fantasies and tormented her 3 times a day. Lydia never forgave her sister and brother for leaving her there. She couldn't reconcile and tried to run away from home more than once. However, her father spread the information that his youngest daughter suffered from a mental illness. Therefore, when she approached the authorities, they immediately took her back home. After another escape attempt, Raymond completely chained the girl. When Lydia turned 18, her father decided it was time for her to bear his children. The man was so eager to realize his idea that after each act of intimacy, he tied the girl's legs, supposedly to increase the chances of pregnancy. At the age of 19, Lydia became pregnant for the first time and spent almost the entire next 9 months on a leash, as the man wanted to prevent possible abortion attempts. Lydia gave birth to her first child on December 8, 1982. The boy was named Raymond in honor of his father. Subsequently, Lydia did not give up her attempts to escape, but Raymond kept catching her and punishing her harshly. One day, she was locked in the attic for 6 months. During this time, her father and stepmother repeatedly mistreated her, often with improvised means and kitchen utensils. The rats became the girl's only friends. The first child was followed by 5 more children born between 1986 and 1996. Reports indicate that the last child, named Rudy, was not Raymond's son and was conceived during Lydia's next escape attempt. The children were, of course, the great pride of their vile father. Initially, they didn't even know who their real mother was. Neighbors, grocery store owners, and even local government officials came to greet the head of a large family and show their respect. Raymond, in turn, did not hide the origin of his children. This information was like an open secret. Every time Lydia prepared for childbirth, the man took her to a hospital outside their area and forced her to say under threat of death that he was her partner and the father of the children. Raymond knew exactly how to manipulate the girl, and Lydia simply lacked the strength or means to resist him. The end of this story came in 1999 when Raymond Guado, a diabetic, began to seriously deteriorate in health. In general, he never took care of his health. This time, however, the situation worsened significantly and several toes on his left foot were amputated. After the operation, the man again disregarded the doctor's recommendations, putting himself in a critical condition. One day, Lydia visited him in the hospital and learned that he had died the night before from a pulmonary embolism. When the girl heard this news, she burst into tears. It was as if she had forgotten in an instant everything that had happened to her because of the deceased. Later, Lydia could not explain the reason for such a reaction to the death of the man who had tormented her for so long. Perhaps it was because Raymond, despite everything, was the only constant in her miserable life. After leaving the hospital building, the girl remembered how she had once sworn to Raymond that she would end her life immediately after his death. Apparently, the years of control by the deceased had affected Lydia's consciousness. She drove to the nearest bridge and jumped into the river without hesitation. As she fell, she lost consciousness, and when she regained it, she was surrounded by rescuers who had pulled her from the water. At that moment, she realized that the horror of the past was behind her. Thus ended a story full of bullying, aggression, and imprisonment that lasted 28 years. Lydia was finally free. However, to her regret, she felt no satisfaction that Raymond had faced justice. After her release, Lydia, an illiterate and unemployed girl, faced several more difficult trials. She had to rebuild her life and establish relationships with her children, who had been raised by her father and stepmother and were denied any communication with her. Fortunately, after many years of ignoring the existing problem, the authorities provided support. Lydia was initially allowed to stay and live in the house where she had been held captive, although she no longer dared to go up to the attic, where she had been subjected to unspeakable abuse. Lydia's stepmother, then 68 years old, appeared in court only in 2007. Unfortunately, justice was not truly served in her case. The elderly woman was sentenced to 3 years probation for not preventing what her husband had done before her eyes. This sentence was later appealed and increased to 4 years probation. In 2008, when the media were in an uproar over another case of a woman who had been imprisoned for a long time, Lydia found the courage to tell everyone about her own experiences. She was still illiterate, but thanks to her collaboration with journalist and writer Jean-Michel Carrat, she was able to publish a book describing her thorny path to freedom. In her book, she criticized various government agencies that, in her opinion, had sent her back to hell during her escape attempts without even trying to understand the situation. In the book, Lydia paid special attention to her stepmother, a woman who had not only stood on the sidelines all those years, but had also actively participated in physical violence against her and other children. The medical staff who had treated her injuries, such as burns, bruises, and cuts, also did not escape her criticism. According to Lydia, the employees of the medical institutions simply turned a blind eye to the obvious signs of her mistreatment and preferred to remain on the sidelines. For similar reasons, Lydia criticized her neighbors, who, in her opinion, heard the children's cries every day, but still did not dare to contact any social organization and invite their workers to visit their home. Finally, Lydia blamed the entire French justice system for the inaction and the incomprehensible sentence imposed on her stepmother. After the publication of her book, the public learned about the horrors she had endured. At that moment, Lydia declared that she finally did not feel alone. She noted that while writing the material, some people had told her not to talk about what had happened to her, as it was personal. However, she believed that victims of such crimes should talk about everything, because it could save other people. In 2014, a book titled Ordinary Incest by ethnologist Léonore Lecour, a researcher at the National Center for Scientific Research in France, one of the world's most prestigious institutions, was published. In this publication, the author discussed Lydia's case, based on a year-long ethnographic study conducted in the town of Carlon, where the main events took place. Léonore tried to understand why none of the residents condemned Raymond's actions or reported the bullying to the authorities. Perhaps the answer to this question was hidden in a sentence spoken by one of the interviewed residents. When asked by the book's author, this man replied that, in his opinion, what happens behind the doors of a house should stay there. Sometime after gaining her freedom, Lydia met a man named Sylvain Skerla. Sylvain was apparently the man who came into her life to heal her soul from deep pain. Shortly after they met, the couple married and had 2 children. Lydia said she found hope in her husband. After meeting the love of her life, she gave several more interviews to the media and participated in the creation of several documentaries about her story. She still lives with indelible memories of her captivity, and the scars on her body constantly remind her of it. At the end of the 2000s, Lydia, with the support of a lawyer, turned to the Justice Commission to receive payments that victims of certain crimes are entitled to. In her appeal, she claimed that in addition to the torture and abuse by her guardians, she was also denied the opportunity for education, which undoubtedly made it difficult for her to find work. Moreover, she was not even registered with Social Security, since she still couldn't write and therefore couldn't fill out the necessary forms herself. The appeal also stated that due to the burns she had suffered in her youth, she had a certain degree of disability.
One day, a good-looking young man entered a cafe called Broad Arrow in the historic town of Port Arthur. His long blonde hair framed his gaunt face. The man looked around the room where several guests were sitting and then decided to go to the first floor and settle on the balcony. He ordered a whole mountain of food. His appetite was whetted because he already suspected what he would do after the hearty meal. The strange guest took his time to empty the plates, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and picked up the sports bag from under the table. Afterwards, he went down the stairs, found a free table in the corner, and sat down there. The young man carefully took the video camera out of the bag and positioned it so that the lens covered most of the room. The preparations were complete. Time to get started, he thought. From his bag, he pulled out a rifle. He was the 28-year-old Martin Bryant, an Australian who wanted the whole country to know about him. Martin John Bryant was born on May 7, 1967 in Tasmania, Australia. He was the firstborn son in the family of Carlin and Morris Bryant. Later, Martin also had a younger sister, Lindy. The boy's childhood was quite ordinary at first glance, but Martin himself could not be described as such. From a young age, this child was very different from the others. He was not like everyone else. He loved to annoy and tease others and do things that upset everyone. Martin was so troublesome that even his parents were tired of dealing with him. If left alone, the boy would start to break everything he could get his hands on. At some point, his mother noticed strange behavior. He seemed to detach from reality, became distant and apathetic, then he would abruptly return to his normal state and start bullying his younger sister. At school, Bryant was extremely disruptive, aggressive, and violent. His behavior caused problems not only for the other students but also for the teachers. The parents knew their son annoyed everyone he met but could do nothing about it and wrote it off as a character trait. At the age of 10, Martin was expelled from primary school due to his aggressive behavior. During a counseling session with a psychologist, the boy stated that he enjoyed torturing animals. This greatly alarmed the specialist. He advised the parents to pay special attention to their son's strange tendencies, as animal cruelty was a bad sign. The parents ignored all warning signs, hoping their child would grow into a normal person. A year later, Martin returned to school, and although his behavior had improved, he still annoyed the younger children. He did not learn well and found it difficult to acquire knowledge. So his transfer to the special education unit at Newtown High School was a logical consequence, but even there no progress was evident. The learning and behavioral problems continued to worsen. After a few years, Martin left school. During this time, he became even more withdrawn and spent most of his time alone. Bryant had absolutely no friends and rarely left the house. When the parents realized something was wrong with their son, they took him to a psychiatrist. The doctor examined the teenager, conducted a series of tests, and came to disappointing conclusions. In the intelligence test, Martin scored only 66 points, which was considered an indicator of an intellectual disability. The results were particularly low in verbal and nonverbal reasoning, as well as in cognitive functions that allow humans to rationally perceive and analyze the world around them, adapt to its conditions, and interact with others. Martin's mental development corresponded to that of an 11-year-old child. The psychiatrist also diagnosed Bryant with autism and Asperger's syndrome. In his report, the doctor noted that Martin could neither read nor write. He emphasized the importance of the efforts parents must make to prevent further deterioration. If they do not intervene and spend more time on their son's upbringing so that he can become a fully fledged member of society, he will definitely have a bleak future. Based on the examination results, he received a disability pension. His mother and father truly did their best to ensure Martin grew into a normal person. Eventually, he even had a hobby that he tried to develop, and he was quite good at it. He enjoyed digging in the garden, working with plants, mowing the lawn, and even managed to earn money doing it. In 1987, when he was 19 years old, Martin met 54-year-old Helen Harvey, winner of a share in a lottery business. The woman owned a large old mansion where she lived with her elderly mother. Helen liked the young gardener so much that she decided to support him and offered him the job of landscaping her large estate. The grounds looked as if they had been neglected for a long time. The soil was overgrown with weeds, the branches of the shrubs had turned into an impenetrable jungle, and some of the trees had withered. Martin had a lot to do, and so he spent all his free time at Helen Harvey's mansion tending to the plants. The landlady and the young gardener became friends. The woman often invited the young man for lunch, had lively conversations with him, and told him about her life. Everything seemed wonderful until one day a strange and unexpected event occurred. The health authorities received an anonymous call reporting the plight of the female resident of the mansion. The caller said that besides the owner and her elderly mother, there were 14 dogs and more than 40 cats living in the house. The animals were breeding uncontrollably, defecating everywhere, and had turned the house into an uninhabitable place. It turned out that the inside of the mansion was in as bad a condition as the outside. The health authorities checked the information and found that the unsanitary conditions in which the women lived were indeed affecting their health. Both women were hospitalized. The health department ordered the immediate removal of all animals. Furthermore, Helen was strictly forbidden from keeping pets in the future. As a good friend would, Martin offered to clean the house while Helen and her mother were in the hospital. He reassured the woman that she didn't need to worry, he would get it right. His father, Morris, helped with the cleanup. The two of them cleared out a pile of junk the owner had accumulated, cleaned the walls, furniture, and windows, and removed traces of animal activity. Unfortunately, Helen's mother passed away at the age of 79 while she was in the hospital. When the owner returned to her mansion, devastated by the loss of her mother, everything there had changed. The huge house, once filled with life, had become empty and uncomfortable. No one scurried under her feet anymore, scratched at the walls, or woke her up at night. Helen felt very lonely in the empty building. For a while, she tried to accept the silence and get used to it, but she soon realized she couldn't live alone. She needed some company. Since her mother had died in the hospital and Helen had no other relatives, she turned to her young friend Martin and asked him to live with her in the mansion. To her surprise and delight, he immediately accepted the invitation and moved into the house. From that moment on, the two were inseparable. Of course, the relationship between Helen and Martin was purely platonic. They were simply good friends, brightening each other's dull daily lives. Over the next 3 years, the mansion owner and the gardener spent almost every day together. They would get up at noon, get dressed, and go to a nice restaurant or cafe. The rest of the day they spent in shops and shopping. From time to time, Helen and Martin went on cruises, of course, all at Harvey's expense. At some point, the time came when Martin's disability pension had to be reassessed. The psychiatrist noted some negative changes in the young man's behavior which worried him. Martin told the doctor he had an unusual desire. He would like to shoot living people. In his report, the psychiatrist wrote that Martin showed aggression towards other members of society. The doctor concluded that it was not safe to remove Bryant from his parents' control at that time, so living with Helen in the house now was not a good idea. But the parents were not convinced by the specialist's warnings. Their son felt comfortable enough in Harvey's house. Helen never once complained about him, never accused him of aggressive behavior or anything similar. Martin's father and mother also supported the friendship with Helen because their son had no other friends. His peers did not want to communicate with him, so the Bryants thought such a friendship could do no harm. Life in Harvey's mansion continued as usual. Helen was only worried about one thing. She desperately wanted to get pets, but by law, she was not allowed to keep them in her house. The woman decided to change the situation and buy a new house. In 1991, she moved with Martin to a 72-hectare farm called Taurus Wheel in the small town of Coping. Helen focused her attention on the farm and the animals. There, she spent most of her time full of energy. Meanwhile, Martin was fascinated by weapons. He acquired an air pistol, which he took everywhere with him. Neighbors recalled that he often shot at tourists' cars with it when they stopped at a kiosk on the highway and late at night. He would wander through the neighborhood, shooting the rifle into the air to annoy the local dogs and make them bark. His childhood habit of tormenting and annoying people also manifested in adulthood. Although Martin didn't cause much harm, he could very easily spoil the mood. He was a very strange man, but he managed to lead a more or less stable life on the farm until he and Helen were involved in a car accident on October 20, 1992. Harvey was driving, and Martin was in the passenger seat when their car suddenly swerved onto the other side of the road and crashed into oncoming traffic. Both were seriously injured. Martin was taken to the hospital, where he had to recover from severe neck and back injuries for the next 7 months. Helen, unfortunately, was not so lucky and did not survive the car accident. Harvey's acquaintances and neighbors knew that the woman never drove faster than 60 km/h because Martin had a bad habit of grabbing the steering wheel while she was driving and yanking it in different directions. The man was amused that Helen panicked in such moments, and he found that funny. Because of the young man's silly and stupid pranks, they had already been involved in 3 car accidents. And now that the police officers had learned about it, they wanted to talk to him. Unfortunately, Martin's interrogation yielded no results and no arrest was made. The man denied his involvement in the tragedy, so the investigators backed off and classified it as a tragic accident. Martin Bryant was named the sole heir in Helen Harvey's will, as the woman had no close relatives after her mother's death, and the young man was her only friend. He received a fortune totaling more than $550,000. While the young man was recovering in a hospital bed, his father, Morris, moved to Torusville to put things in order. The parents realized that their son's entire inheritance would be squandered immediately, as Martin had only a vague understanding of financial matters. His mother, Carlin, applied for a guardianship order, which was granted to her. Due to Martin's diminished mental capacity and psychological problems, it was not difficult to convince the court that it was an involuntary order, and Carlin Bryant was given the authority to manage the newly acquired assets. After 7 long months in the hospital, Martin was finally discharged and returned to the Torusville farm, only to find that all his money, including the funds in the joint bank account with Helen, was now in his mother's hands, and his father had established his own routines in the house and on the farm. On August 14, 1993, about 2 months after Martin's return from the hospital, the farmhouse where his father, Morris, lived was visited by one of his buddies. He found that no one was in the house, but strangely, Morris's car was parked in the driveway, and a note saying "Call the police" was pinned to the front door. The father's bewildered buddy went to Morris's car and looked inside. He saw several $1,000s in cash lying in the most prominent place in the cabin. All this was so strange that the man decided not to wait any longer and immediately called the police. The police officers searched the house and the entire farm area but found no trace of Morris's presence. They also found no evidence that anything had happened to the man. There were 4 dams on the farm, and the police brought in a team of divers to search the bottom of the water bodies. After a 2-day search, the body of Morris Bryant was found in the water of the dam closest to the house. Something was looped around the man's neck. Investigators described his death as unnatural, and it was eventually determined that he had died by suicide. After the mysterious death of his father, Martin inherited his savings, amounting to more than $200,000. He sold the farmhouse for $143,000 and moved back to the old mansion in Newtown where he once lived with Helen. The young man himself had also changed since his father's death. Whereas he used to dress very casually and usually wore white work overalls, he now had a completely changed style. Bryant's clothing became more flamboyant. He often wore a gray linen suit, a scarf, lizard skin shoes, and a blue suit with flared trousers with ruffles. Everywhere he went, he carried a briefcase to look like a businessman. Whereas Martin had previously exhibited antisocial behavior, had no friends apart from Helen Harvey, and only annoyed people with his presence, he now craved social interaction. Bryant deliberately changed his style to look fashionable and presentable, as if he had a successful career and was now flourishing. As a child and teenager, his peers had considered him strange, avoided him, or outright bullied him. Now he felt the need to fill this void, that is, to be recognized and gain authority. Whenever Martin met people, he would always brag about how successful his business was, hoping to arouse the other person's interest, but it never went beyond short, meaningless conversations. Acquaintances never turned into relationships or friendships. People just listened to him politely and went on their way, laughing at the strange guy in their hearts. Then Martin found a restaurant where he would show up in full regalia. The staff were nice to him, but the patrons often made fun of the strange young man dressed like Austin Powers from the 60s, the hero of the film of the same name. They made fun of his awkwardness and unconventional appearance. The restaurant owner recalled feeling sorry for the man because he obviously had no friends. In the following 2 years, between 1993 and 1995, Bryant became increasingly withdrawn. As the situation worsened, he decided to use the money from his inheritance to travel, hoping it would bring him as much joy as it used to when he traveled with Helen. Martin undertook 14 international solo trips, and each one evoked a dual feeling in him. He hated the destinations, but he loved the flights. This was because there were always other passengers with him in the aircraft cabin who couldn't just get up and leave their seats. Therefore, they had to listen to Martin's chatter. In those moments, the young man received the human company he seemed to lack. The flight itself was a memorable vacation for him, not the place where he eventually landed. Unfortunately, these meaningless conversations could not satisfy what Martin wanted. Although the conversations brought more joy than money or things, they happened too infrequently. By the end of 1995, Bryant's loneliness reached its peak, and he no longer liked his life. After a failed attempt, he started drinking heavily. When he was later asked why he had lost interest in life, Martin said he simply felt that people had turned against him. When he tried to be friendly to them, they just walked away. Bryant drank daily and spent most of his time alone with his thoughts in a large, empty house. Occasionally, he went outside and tried to strike up a conversation with his neighbors, but they too mostly avoided his company. One day, Martin told a neighbor that one day he would do something so that everyone would remember his name. Of course, the neighbor paid no attention to the drunken owner of the mansion. But from that day on, Bryant actually began to plan something that would make his name known throughout Australia. A couple named David and Nolan Martin owned a hotel called Seascape. The Martins acquired the property that Bryant's father Morris had wanted to buy before them. At that time, Morris was short of money. While he was raising the necessary funds, the hotel was bought by David and Nolan. Later, Morris repeatedly complained to his son that he had missed the opportunity to improve the family's financial situation, and Martin blamed the couple who had taken possession of the property. He believed they intentionally wanted to harm his family. This directly led to his father dying by his own will due to the stress and worry about the lost profits. Martin believed this was the sole cause of Morris's depression. The young man especially missed his father, with whom he had a very close mental bond. Apart from Helen, Morris was the only person who loved him and accepted all his quirks. The man did not avoid contact with his son and never condemned him for his misbehavior. Every morning, Martin woke up thinking about Morris and the couple, the current owners of the Seascape. For him, these people were directly connected to his father's sudden death. One day, Bryant woke up and realized he was ready to carry out his plan. It was April 28, 1996, a date that has become a day of mourning in Australia. At 11:45 a.m., the young man entered the Seascape Hotel and found both owners there. Besides them, no one was in the hotel. Martin pulled out a gun and shot the couple several times. He explained nothing to them, he simply did what he thought was right. A moment later, Bryant heard a car drive into the yard and the doors slam. He realized he didn't need any witnesses at the moment, so he pulled himself together, went outside, introduced himself as the owner's son, said the hotel was temporarily closed, and asked the tourists to come back later. After they left, Martin found the keys to the front door, locked the hotel, and left. It took him about an hour for all this. Now he was on his way to his next destination. On the way, Bryant noticed a young couple standing by their car. They had had a minor breakdown. Martin stopped the car, but not to help. He advised them to go to Port Arthur because it would soon be fun there. Port Arthur is a town in southeastern Tasmania with about 200 inhabitants. Directly southeast of the town, on the other side of the strait, is the Tasman National Park. Port Arthur was known for being the site of a penal colony until 1877. After the prison closed, Port Arthur became a beloved tourist destination. That's where Martin was headed. Having arrived there, the young man entered a cafe called Broad Arrow, carrying a large blue sports bag. He took a seat at a table on the balcony and ordered a large meal. After eating, Bryant went down the stairs and looked around the lounge. There were only a few customers in the cafe, but Martin spotted a free table in the far corner and went towards it. He took out his camera, aimed the lens at the lounge, and pressed the record button. Then he pulled a semi-automatic AR-15 rifle from his sports bag, held it at his hip, and began shooting at the cafe's guests and staff. Within 15 seconds, 20 people fell dead and 10 more were wounded. Martin then left the cafe and went to the other side of the street, where he killed 8 more bystanders and wounded 2 others. Throughout the ordeal, Bryant was completely calm. Despite the chaos around him, he took his time getting into his car, changed the clip, and drove further down the road, shooting at conspicuous passers-by from the window. If people tried to run away, Martin pursued them and caught them anyway. He didn't care if the person in front of him was male, female, or a minor. Bryant drove 300 m down the road and saw a woman with 2 children. He stopped and fired 2 shots. When the mother fell with the baby in her arms, the second girl tried to run away, but Martin caught the victim with a shot. Then he decided it would be a good idea to change vehicles to disguise himself. Looking around, he spotted a gold-colored BMW in the parking lot. It didn't bother Bryant in the slightest that there were 4 people in the car. He killed them all, one by one. After driving a short distance, Martin saw a white Toyota with a man and a woman inside. The gunman stopped next to the couple, drew his weapon, and ordered the man to get into the trunk of the BMW. After the hostage complied, Martin slammed the trunk shut and fired 2 shots into the windshield of the white Toyota. The female driver died at the scene. Bryant then returned to the Seascape Hotel with the hostage and set the stolen car on fire so it wouldn't be discovered immediately. The man Martin pulled from the trunk of the BMW was even more horrified when he saw the owners of the mini-hotel lying in a pool of blood. Bryant was quickly identified as the sole suspect in the shooting. Soon after, the police officers received a call made from his mobile phone. Despite his actions, he was located very quickly. The conversation lasted several hours until the battery of Martin's mobile phone ran out. They offered him to surrender and asked him what he intended to achieve with the indiscriminate shootings, but the man never explained anything. The only demand he could make was for an army helicopter to take him to the airport so he could leave the country unhindered. Of course, the authorities would not let a criminal who had killed and injured several dozen people get away. They tried to free the hostage, but Martin refused to let him go. When communication broke down, the officers remained outside. At this point, their main goal was to free the abducted man before they could arrest the kidnapper. The police could no longer negotiate but were determined to rescue the hostage alive, even though there was no one left to save. Martin killed the man immediately after the conversation with the police. The next morning, 18 hours later, Bryant realized he couldn't stay in that hotel forever, so he decided to set the mini hotel on fire and flee. When the commotion began, he jumped out through the back door. By this time, the fire had already spread rapidly through the building, and his clothes caught fire. Martin suffered burns on his back and buttocks. He was immediately apprehended and taken to the hospital for medical treatment. Strong security measures were put in place outside his room to prevent Bryant from making another escape attempt. The shooter was treated for his burns under strict supervision. Despite Martin's psychological problems and low intelligence, which had been noted in previous psychiatric reports, he was found fit to stand trial. Bryant initially pleaded not guilty, but Martin's sister and a court-appointed lawyer convinced the young man to plead guilty to all charges. The trial began on November 7, 1996. In his senseless rampage, the man had mercilessly sent 35 people to their deaths and injured 23 others. 2 weeks later, a Supreme Court judge sentenced him to 35 life sentences, one for each person killed, plus 1652 years without the possibility of parole, all to be served concurrently. Martin did not take any of this seriously. In interviews, he joked about his sentence, and it was quite obvious that the man felt no remorse for his horrific actions. Martin acted as if the whole thing were a joke, and he was not the one who had ruined the lives of dozens of families and taken the future from 35 people. But once the shooter was behind prison walls, all his cheerfulness and lightheartedness disappeared. Martin quickly came to the conclusion that he would rather die than spend the rest of his life behind bars. But the authorities were serious. They didn't want to let him get away with it so easily. So for the first few years, he was housed in a special cell with glass walls so that the prisoner was always in sight. Then Bryant was moved to solitary confinement and continued to be individually monitored for his own safety. A man who had taken the lives of others had to learn the full harshness of imprisonment. Ending his life would have saved him from punishment, but that was not in the authorities' plans. After 10 years behind bars, Martin was transferred to a new prison under the same conditions. And in November 2006, he was moved to a secure psychiatric hospital for inmates with severe mental disorders. Unlike in prison, the patients were not locked in wards. They could move freely throughout the hospital, and the outside area was strictly monitored by armed guards. Martin initially amused himself by attacking other patients in the clinic, but in 2007 he resorted to a blade and tried to end his desolate existence. It was his 5th attempt since being taken into custody. As in all other cases, hospital staff intervened before he could carry out his plan, but just 2 days later he made his 6th attempt. Martin again took a knife and stabbed himself. He was hospitalized and literally brought back from the dead. He was then transferred to the psychiatric ward of another prison. Since 2021, Bryant has been housed in a maximum security prison and has only soft items in his cell, no sharp ones. Martin has since gained weight and lost his hair, but he continues to be violent towards both staff and other inmates. Recently, he broke a nurse's jaw, after which it was decided to keep him heavily sedated most of the time to reduce his anger and violent outbursts. Instead of attacking people, the sedated Bryant now offers other inmates chocolate in exchange for intimate favors. Martin's mother, Carlin, visits her son every few weeks. She believes none of this would have happened if he hadn't lost his father. The woman has supported her son since the Port Arthur incident. Even before the trial began, Carlin convinced everyone around her that her son could not have done such a thing. She claimed the police had no evidence that Martin had ever been to Port Arthur. It is unlikely that the woman herself believed what she said, But in a 60-minute interview before the trial, she stubbornly insisted on Martin's innocence. Even though her son had confessed to everything, Carlin tried to convince the public that he didn't know what he was doing, that he couldn't be believed. In contrast to his mother, Martin's sister, however, did not support her brother in any way. She never doubted that he could have committed a senseless shooting that affected dozens of innocent citizens. The young woman wanted nothing to do with the crime at all. She did not want to be associated with Martin in any way, which is why she completely changed her name, quit her job, and moved away from home to avoid being associated with her brother's horrific actions. His sister has cut off all contact and is not in touch with any of her former acquaintances. It is unclear what prompted Bryant to commit such a heinous crime. However, authorities suspect he was driven by revenge, a desire for attention, and a desire to control others who had previously rejected the young man. Whatever motivated Bryant to commit such a heinous crime, he will undoubtedly spend the rest of his life in prison. As it stands, his life behind bars will be quite miserable. Bryant spends most of his time alone. He himself has given up the opportunity to exercise and spend time in the prison yard. In the early days, he often received letters from women who had seen pictures of him in the news, but Martin didn't even open the envelopes. It later became known that Bryant was in a relationship with a woman named Petra Willman at the time of his arrest. They had been together for a few months, but Petra visited him twice in prison after his arrest. She eventually ended her relationship with Martin and moved to a remote village to avoid negative influences on her. So Martin was not so alone when he decided to commit mass murder. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves. When a criminal is consumed by bloodlust, it is difficult to stop him, especially when you are only 10 years old. How can one escape such a situation? Will simple luck be enough to make the bullets disappear? The protagonists of the story lived in a secluded house near the small town of Pampa, Texas, USA. 10-year-old Robin Doan was the daughter of Michelle Conrad. The girl lived with her stepfather, Brian, and her older brother, Zach Doan. Together, the couple owned their own farmhouse, and the head of the family was involved in agriculture. He managed to build a fairly profitable business. The children grew up in the environment of a typical rural province where everything is always quiet and nothing happens. After separating from the children's biological father, Michelle quickly met a new man with whom she began to live. Brian proved to be a pleasant man who quickly found common ground with the woman's children. Soon, they married and lived together. All this happened a few years before the tragic events that not only shook the entire neighborhood but also shocked the whole country with their cruelty and senselessness. In September 2005, Michelle was 6 months pregnant. Everyone was looking forward to the new arrival, especially Brian, who wanted to become a father. At this time, Robin was 10 years old and lived the typical life of a schoolgirl, determined and very bright. She was in regular contact with her mother, her brother, her stepfather, and even with her biological father. He came to visit her, and the girl sometimes went to him in the summer. September 30, 2005 was a completely normal day. Nothing indicated blood and cruelty. In the evening, Robin went to bed. Suddenly, she woke up in the middle of the night and thought she was having a nightmare, as she first heard gunshots and then her mother screaming. The schoolgirl realized that it was not a dream but that something disturbing was happening on the ground floor of her house. The girl got out of her bed and ran to the door to hear what was going on, but loud footsteps were heard outside the door. Someone stopped right in front of her room. The door opened with a creak. Meanwhile, the girl had jumped into bed. She managed to get to the bed as quickly as possible. When the door swung open, there were several deafening bangs. 2 of the bullets missed her, but Robin felt they were only centimeters from her left leg and left arm. One of the bullets had hit a closet, but apparently the perpetrator had not noticed in the darkness that he had missed her. The murderer went into the next room where the girl's brother was sleeping. Gunshots rang out. The boy sobbed, and then the intruder left. Robin was terrified. She played dead and it worked, but she had no idea where the murderer was. No sense of time, and she was just afraid to move. The whole time, it seemed to her as if the villain would return and with an awkward movement reveal that she was still alive and he would finish her off. In this state, the girl lay in her bed for about 2.5 hours before she could gather her strength and get up. She looked around. The gunman was nowhere to be found. Robin took her cell phone to dial emergency services. Even that was difficult. She still feared that the perpetrator was here, had heard it, and would finish what he had started. During the night, emergency services received a call from a schoolgirl who identified herself as Robin Down. The girl reported that she was cold and scared, that she heard gunshots and screams from her family, but did not dare to go around the house to look for them because she feared the perpetrator was somewhere nearby. Since no one had screamed or shown any sign of life recently, she feared the worst. The girl asked what had happened and where her family was. Robin made her way to the kitchen and just stared out the window, waiting for help. As soon as she saw the flashing lights of the patrol cars, she ran out onto the street and rushed towards the police officers. Robin was in shock and was taken to one of the patrol cars. Several patrol car crews armed themselves and set about investigating the crime scene in case the perpetrator was still inside and could shoot back. Here, a bloody picture awaited the police officers. The entire family seemed to have been shot. Brian was shot 3 times. Michelle was hit 6 times. Even the dog was shot twice. Zach Doan was killed while the boy slept in his bed. He probably didn't even wake up as one of the bullets hit him directly in the head. Michelle was also shot. She was 2 months away from giving birth to a little boy who also died in the womb. The cartridge casings found in the house matched an AK-47 assault rifle. Such cartridge casings are usually not sold in a normal gun store but are bought to order or in limited quantities. The whole time, the little girl sat in a patrol car waiting for news from the police. She hoped someone had survived. When one of the officers returned and stated that the criminal had long since fled, Robin had calmed down a bit. But now she cried again when she learned that her loved ones had been killed. She was told to go to the station and talk to the police officers. Robin wanted the police officers to feed the animals with her before they left so she could recover a little. In that moment, Robin seemed disconnected from reality as she fed her goats in the barn and told the officer how she and her brother had won prizes in a competition. But at some point, she returned to reality, cried, grabbed the police officer by the shoulder, and asked when her family would leave the house. The man was forced to tell her again that she was the only survivor of the tragedy. She was first taken to a nearby medical center where she received care. Here, she became painfully aware of what had happened, and she cried a lot because she did not understand who could have killed her entire family. Psychologists were supposed to work with Robin, but that would take a very long time. It was clear to the investigators that they were dealing with a very dangerous criminal. Time was running out. He had to be stopped before the intruder struck again. The doctors examined the child and confirmed that Robin was unharmed, so the police immediately took her to the station to talk to her and offer her the necessary protection. The girl made contact with the police officers and communicated with them. Unfortunately, Robin did not see what happened. The investigators suspected that her stepfather or her mother might have had a violent argument with someone shortly before the events, but that was not the case. The girl denied everything. There was a theory that someone was involved with bad company or illegal substances, but Robin also denied this. She could not name anyone who might hate the family and attack them with a weapon. She described in detail everything she had heard, but she could not describe the perpetrator's appearance. She had not seen him directly, but only caught a fleeting glimpse of a dark silhouette, so she could not provide any valuable clues. The only thing she knew for sure was that the attacker was light-skinned. Only one important detail puzzled them. The girl counted 15 shots and confidently stated this number. During the investigation of the crime scene, cartridge casings were found here. The perpetrator had fired exactly 15 times. It seemed that the 10-year-old girl who was in such a dangerous environment could not have remembered this number. Perhaps she just rounded up because she heard many shots, significantly more than 10. In any case, the police officers were concerned for the girl's safety. At this point, it was completely unclear who could have had a motive for the attack and what the perpetrator's goal was. Perhaps he intended to eliminate everyone and was principled in doing so. Then he would have to return to finish what he had started and eliminate the only witness. After Robin survived the attack, she was placed in a special center for victims of violence for her protection, where she was cared for by her biological father, her stepmother, and her half-sister. Of course, police officers were also on duty there. Until then, the girl had lived with her mother and stepfather. Now, only her father could provide support and help. He came in the middle of the night to pick up his daughter. As soon as the interrogation was over, they were taken to the center. Robin was told that this was for her safety and she was forbidden to leave the organization's premises. She understood this as she was very afraid of another attack. Despite the prohibition on leaving, Robin was to attend her family's funeral, but she was allowed to go there under police escort. People from a large part of the town where they lived had gathered. Many knew the couple and spoke well of them. The loss of 3 people was a severe blow to the entire community. This community was in Texas and was a typical agricultural suburb where a tragedy of this magnitude was difficult for everyone to bear. For Robin and everyone present, the 3 coffins brought to the memorial service were a nightmare. No one could imagine that these nice people could die like that. The investigators decided to take full advantage of the situation. No one concealed information about the place and time of the memorial service. On the contrary, the police officers even hoped to meet the attacker here. If the attacker wanted to strike again, there was no better time than the family funeral. Several officers, who were ready at any time to disarm and arrest the perpetrator, checked everyone present while keeping an eye on Robin, who was surrounded by her father, her stepmother, and her stepsister. Unfortunately, nothing of interest could be identified at this event. By this time, the forensics team had already completed their investigation of the crime scene. It was true all found what could help identify the perpetrator, but there were no concrete clues to the murderer. The data was, however, important. Inside the house, they found shoe prints. Outside, on the house wall, there were tire tracks. The forensic experts collected all the prints and also carefully analyzed the tire tread patterns. Unfortunately, no fingerprints or DNA of the shooter could be found at the crime scene. There was only the victim's blood. Apparently, the attacker himself suffered no injuries as he took the family by surprise. The victims simply had no time to defend themselves and fight back. Since there were no fingerprints, it was assumed that he used protective gloves. The back door of the house was broken open, which indicated a burglar. No valuables were missing from the house, although many items that could have been sold for good money were lying around openly, and even a wallet with cash. Therefore, the investigators concluded that the motive for the attack could not have been robbery, but it also did not look like the behavior of an addicted person who was unaware of their actions. The murderer had acted clearly and methodically, shooting the family members one by one, but there was a catch. The deceased had no enemies who might resort to weapons. The police checked the entire neighborhood of the couple and the survivor's older brother, but no one aroused suspicion. In fact, no one had a motive. They all seemed to be decent, friendly, and peace-loving people who were not in conflict with anyone. The surviving girl's father was with his family in a neighboring town, and his wife confirmed that he was sleeping in his bed. And gradually, all the leads the investigators pursued led to a dead end. In the family's immediate circle, there were no individuals who could point to a single suspect. Yet behind the brutal massacre of the family, there seemed to be a serious motive, a personal one, perhaps jealousy, revenge, or resentment. On the day before the murder of Robin's family in the small town of Pineville, Missouri, relatives had been unable to reach their loved ones all day. In the evening, they arrived at their house. Surprisingly, no family was present. Instead, everything was sealed off with police tape. A neighbor told them that a terrible crime had occurred here. It turned out that Oral and Don Makulov had been shot by an unknown perpetrator the day before. At this time, criminologists were still working here. They also spoke with the relatives who had arrived, but no one could provide clues to a possible suspect. However, the most curious thing was found in the house. Here they found cartridge casings of an atypical caliber that is not easy to obtain in the United States. They came from AK-47 cartridges. Just one day after the crime, a report of burglary and theft was filed at the station. Mr. King, who lived in the same area in Missouri, found that his house had been broken into. He was on a business trip in another city. The man was absent for a few days, and when he returned, he saw gun safes that had been opened and were empty. According to him, he had a weapon rather rare for the USA, an AK-47 along with ammunition. It could not be a coincidence. The attacker who had shot the family had taken King's weapons. Mr. King was thoroughly checked and the man had a solid alibi. He was indeed away on a trip at the time of the shooting, but there were enough people in his family who could have resorted to weapons. According to the description, the missing cartridges and the assault rifle were identical to the cartridge casings found at the scene of the family massacre. Of course, a ballistics test was required for comparison, but for that, the murder weapon had to be found first. The entire King family appeared for questioning except for one. Only Levy King, the son of the man who had contacted law enforcement and reported the theft, did not show up. He was on the run. Family members speculated that Levy was involved in the murder of the family. The Kings overall did not give the impression of a wealthy family, but Lwi Star stood out particularly. He was a young man in his 20s and well known to the authorities, as he had already served time in prison for burglary. A few years before these events, he had broken into a neighbor's house and after taking valuables had set it on fire. For this, he was sentenced to 4 years in prison, of which he served less than 3. A week earlier, he was supposed to be transferred to another correctional facility. Levy desperately wanted his freedom and fled on the way out. Even after the murder of his family, Robin Levy remained on the run, but at that time, it was not known that there was a connection between these crimes committed in different states. Investigators in Missouri were sure that Levy was extremely dangerous, possessed a weapon, and could use it at any time. Citizens were warned through the media, and if they encountered Levy, they were asked to do nothing and immediately notify the police. From D. King's statement, investigators had a photo of the probable murderer. Among the many valuables that had gone missing from Robin's family in Missouri, the Dodge Dakota pickup that belonged to them jointly was the most conspicuous. The vehicle's data was entered into the search system. Police officers obtained an arrest warrant for the young man in connection with a crime he had committed at the Doan's house. The authorities believed his attack was unmotivated. He basically knew none of his victims. Levy, however, was on the run and needed resources, especially a car to leave the state. The suspected young man was arrested by Border Patrol in El Paso, Texas, on the border with Mexico. He probably wanted to flee there. The man stopped and calmly admitted to having a weapon in his trunk. The authorities were interested in this information and conducted a more thorough check, during which they found that the pickup was stolen. Thereupon, the man, who turned out to be Levy King, was taken to the police station in the city pending clarification of the circumstances. The police officers decided to talk to him to clarify the details of the incident. From the beginning, the young man behaved strangely. In just 15 minutes of conversation with the investigators, he confessed to the double murder of Robin's family. The perpetrator insisted that his victims were a married couple in Pineville, Missouri, and described how they could be found. When the officers checked the information, it turned out that the horrifying story was true. He had killed Oral and Don Marwell. Levy could not even explain why he had done all this. According to the young man's story, he broke into a randomly chosen house on the outskirts of the community to get a car. The decision was justified by nothing other than a feeling he described as an overwhelming urge to kill. When the perpetrator was on the property and began to look around, he was suddenly discovered. The door opened and a woman appeared on the threshold, politely asking what the intruder needed. According to King, he was just scared, so he drew his weapon and fired. A man came to the noise. Levy panicked and could no longer control the situation, so he shot him too. Levy was immediately extradited to Missouri. The local police continued to communicate with the detainee, who again confessed to the crime. From this family, Levy stole a pickup truck and drove off, thereby gaining much more mobility. He also made an even more shocking confession, telling of the murder of the Robin family in Texas. At the scene of the triple murder, the casings were indeed found that matched his statements. The same AK-47 casings. The attacker shot at defenseless people, and when he heard a noise on the second floor, he realized that there were other people there. It was Robin, who had been awakened by the machine gun volleys. The perpetrator was out for blood, so he didn't even look at the victims' ages. Levy simply went up the stairs, began to go around the rooms and shoot the occupants in their beds, hoping to get rid of all witnesses that way. Then he went around the house and fled the scene. After this revelation, the police called their colleagues in Texas. The perpetrator's words were confirmed again. At this point, Robin, who had miraculously survived the attack, feared the murderer's revenge, which is why she was taken into protective custody. The investigators confirmed that everything fit the pattern of the crime and Levy was the wanted man. Finally, the tension eased and the girl could breathe a sigh of relief. By this time, she had barely slept for several days due to all the tension. A day later, investigators from Texas arrived at the station and took Levy with them. According to them, during transport under police escort, the murderer described his emotional state. He said what he experienced during the bloody execution was better than any illegal substances. Even hours after the murder, he could still smell the gunpowder and blood, which he admitted was a true euphoria. Levy shamelessly told this to all the police officers. Already in his office, he told them under video recording that he had first killed the family in Missouri. King felt the urge to kill and was about to get a car to drive to the Mexican border. On the way there, he again felt this overwhelming urge, saw a suitable house standing in the middle of nowhere, and killed the Robin family whom he chose at random and whose house he broke into. He knew none of these people, neither Robin's family nor the McCowell family. Levy realized that he now faced the death penalty, and so he fled to Mexico where he would go into hiding. Now the inmate in Missouri indeed faced the death penalty for the double murder, but on his lawyer's advice, he made a deal with the prosecution to avoid the death penalty. King was sentenced to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole for multiple murders. Now he was to be tried in Texas for triple murder and attempted murder. Here too, he faced the death penalty, but in Texas, the prosecution took a much stronger position and refused to take the death penalty off the table. Cooperation with the prosecution was out of the question. The prosecution believed they had a good chance of forever depriving this monster of the opportunity to poison society with his existence. Nevertheless, hearings had to be held because cases leading to the execution of a criminal are traditionally complex and lengthy. The careful preparation took several years, during which the defendant sat behind bars without bail. In Texas, it was to be decided whether Levy King would be sentenced to execution in Texas or to serve a life sentence in Missouri. When the trial began, Robin was already 14 years old. The hearing took place on the eve of her 15th birthday. The girl was furious, when she realized how senseless and cruel Levi's attack on her family had been. He didn't even have a motive and was driven only by the lust to kill, so she rightly advocated for taking this monster's life. Of course, the defense attorney had his own opinion on this situation. He was serious about defending his client's life. Opinions were divided. While some believed King was unworthy of a life sentence, others insisted that life without parole was the crueler measure he deserved. From the beginning, the defense attorney tried to humanize the image of Levy King to soften the jury's decision. The defense attorney emphasized that he had suffered from bipolar disorder since his youth. Furthermore, doctors had diagnosed depression, psychosis, and at one point schizophrenia at various times in Levy's life. He was one of the couple's 7 children and apparently received no adequate love and care. From an early age, he exhibited antisocial behavior, for which he blamed his brutal, alcoholic father and his indifferent mother. While still in elementary school, Levy committed several arsons, took illegal substances, and killed animals for fun. All this fit into his family's life. His parents suffered from addiction problems and did not care for their children at all. The first person who not only regularly beat the boy but also introduced him to alcohol and illegal substances was his father. Already as a teenager, Levy began to consume hard drugs. He grew up in poverty, filth, and chaos under the constant oppression of his tyrannical father. When police officers entered the house where Levy lived, they were shocked by the atmosphere. He had an entire wall on which ceremonial knives, swords, and firearms hung. Strangely, it was badly burned. Although the young man did not always have money for food, he constantly found money for ammunition and weapons. The young man's militancy clearly contradicted the defense attorney's claims that he was a good guy and merely a victim of circumstances, because he was exposed to a violent environment and a difficult childhood. The prosecutors believed they were dealing with a true predator who was just waiting for the right moment to attack. The story was told of a young man who enjoyed the smell of blood and gunpowder, and told it to the police officers who had extradited him from Missouri. The main witness for the prosecution was Robin, who had miraculously survived the perpetrator's attack. For her, the trial was a traumatic event. She had struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder for all these years and now feared that all her efforts would have been in vain. Nevertheless, she was determined to confront the murderer who had taken her family from her. Later, Robin spoke to journalists. She says that when she first looked the perpetrator in the eyes in court, she was surprised how empty and cold he was. Until that moment, she had been angry with the perpetrator and wished him dead, but when the girl saw his eyes, she forgave the murderer. Robin considered it too wasteful to have feelings for this unfeeling story. She realized that Levy simply could not have grown into a different person. After hearing the arguments from both sides, the 12 jurors deliberated on the verdict. What impressed the jurors most was the fact that the murders of all these innocent people were spontaneous acts of aggression motivated by nothing. All victims were chosen at random. The prosecution described Levy King as a villain and requested the death penalty. The deliberations lasted for several hours. Finally, the jurors decided that the death penalty was too much. Thanks to their compassion, the murderer received a life sentence without parole. Despite the prosecution's urging, Levy King was extradited back to Missouri to serve his life sentence there. For a long time after the massacre of her family, Robin struggled with psychological problems. She often had nightmares. The girl could not sleep well and could not even go outside unaccompanied. Years later, the after-effects of her trauma still manifested, but thanks to her family's support, she was able to overcome everything. Robin thanks fate every day for giving her a chance that her remaining family was denied. Thank you for watching and take care of yourselves. The only way to survive in this world is to live without rules. said the not quite so famous hero of the Batman comics, Joker, and a young man from real life took this quote as a guide for his actions. But what for some is a life without rules can be quite dangerous for others. Jaime Osuna smiled and waved to the family of the woman who died by his hand. At that moment, the judge sentenced him to life imprisonment because he had brutally tortured and killed a 36-year-old young mother. Dressed in a prison uniform and with tattoos on his face, the criminal wanted to show everyone that he felt no remorse. He even showed the judge his raised middle finger to show that he agreed with the verdict. That was exactly what Osuna wanted because he was tired of being part of this society. Some crimes are so heinous that it's hard to imagine they were committed by humans. Jaime Osuna is one of those notorious serial killers who found joy and thrill in torturing, enslaving, and taking the lives of his victims. People called him the real Joker and the man with 1,000 faces because of his numerous tattoos, including the Joker's famous smile and the pentagram on his forehead. Many believed that the real Joker's criminal activities in adulthood were due to his difficult childhood. Jaime Osuna was born on March 7, 1988 in Bakersfield, California. His mother, Michelle, was only 19 years old at the time, his father 21. The relationship between the parents could not be called normal. The man was very violent and often beat his pregnant wife. When Michelle was 9 months pregnant, he kicked her so hard in the stomach that the baby was affected. The young woman forgave the child's father for the incident and they continued their relationship, but a visible reminder of that day remained for life. Little Jaime was born with a noticeable scar under his eye. The child's father finally left Michelle when his son turned 1 year old. The young woman was left with 2 children in her arms with almost no means of livelihood. But she was not alone for long. Michelle started dating a man named Jeff, soon married him, and moved with her 2 children into her husband's house. As it turned out, Jeff also had a son from another relationship, but the new friend wanted Michelle, not her children, and so it was very noticeable how intolerant he was towards the 2 estranged offspring he had to support. Jeff clearly hated both boys, but for some reason it hit the younger Jaime the hardest. One day, the newlyweds and their children returned from a fishing trip. Little Jaime was very tired and started to cry and be moody. Jeff tolerated the boys' antics for a while, but then he got so angry that he turned around, opened the door, and pushed Jaime, who was still strapped into his car seat, out of the moving car. Michelle got a huge fright because she saw a truck driving right behind them. Luckily, the seat landed upright and didn't hit the roadway. Jeff stopped the car so the mother could go back and rescue the child, but refused to take Jaime to the hospital as he had no visible injuries. According to Michelle, he wouldn't even let her drive herself. However, as Jaime got older, doctors determined that he had suffered minor brain damage from the incident. Jaime was still very young when his stepfather tied him to a tree outside for some misbehavior and whipped him with a rope. This time, Michelle didn't stand for it and called the police. It was the only time she intervened because she felt Jeff had misbehaved. Strangely, the woman hadn't felt that way before when her son was thrown out of the moving car. Jeff managed to untie the child, and when the police arrived, he tried to justify himself by saying it was just a joke, they were just playing. But the red marks on Jaime's body told a different story. Jeff was arrested and charged with abuse. However, a few days later, the man returned and everything started all over again. By now, he and Michelle had 2 children together who were treated very differently by the man, and Jeff couldn't accept his 2 stepchildren. It seemed as if the boys annoyed him more every day. Once, in a fit of rage, the man threw a fork at Michelle's eldest son. The fork didn't do much damage, but the boys' grandparents found out about it. They were shocked and, luckily for Osuna's older brother, took him in. But Jaime himself was left behind because, for some reason, the grandfather didn't like his youngest grandson either. The boy had to endure his stepfather's anger and abuse throughout his childhood. Michelle said Jaime was very loving and affectionate, but for some reason the others didn't like him. When the child tried to go to his mother and hug her, his stepfather got really angry. When Jeff scolded him, he wouldn't let the child eat or would put his plate on the floor like a dog. Michelle was very worried. She felt sorry for her son, but she couldn't intervene as she herself was very afraid of her husband. He had hurt her more than once too. Jeff regularly told her that he would punish her if she ever tried to leave him. One day, Michelle couldn't take it anymore, packed some of her things, took the children, and left the house. Her husband caught up with her immediately, beat her, and sprinkled salt on her so that she would remember the lesson for a long time. At school, James was a withdrawn, unsociable child, but none of the teachers asked what was wrong with him. No one asked questions or expressed concern about it. Over the years, the boy's aversion to his stepfather manifested itself in the form of hidden aggression. James began to bully small animals and to self-harm. When he turned 12, his grandparents turned their anger into pity and took the child into their care, but it was too late. Michelle admitted that she had noticed a change in her son by then. He was no longer the sweet and affectionate little boy. James was now completely emotionless, distant, and withdrawn. A few years later, his stepfather Jeff died of a heart attack. As a teenager, Osuna caused his grandparents a lot of trouble. The boy joined a small street gang and began to break the law. He was accused of petty theft, possession and use of illegal substances, disorderly conduct, and numerous fights. With each time, his offenses became more serious and dangerous. Furthermore, at the age of 15, James himself began to use illegal substances. One day, James had a disagreement with another student at school and stabbed him during a fight. As a result of this fight, Osuna spent the next 4 years of his life in a facility for juvenile offenders. Not even a year after his release, James broke the law again, even though he was still on probation. The young man found himself at a house party that a mother was throwing for her 16-year-old child. The woman named Jane thought it was better for her son and his friends to have fun at home in front of her eyes than to go out on the streets at night in the company of drunk youths. She believed that a supervised house party guaranteed her child's safety. Jane used to work as a nurse in prison psychotherapy. She was once brutally attacked by an inmate of the facility where she worked and subsequently changed professions. Jane financed the party in full. She bought drinks, prepared snacks, and started celebrating with the youths. She drank a little too much and started dancing with one of the youths. This behavior did not please her nephew, who asked James, who was standing nearby, to take care of the guy. Osuna didn't take long to persuade. He got a knife from the kitchen and stabbed the teenager who was dancing with Jane. The wound was not serious, but it was the reason for another arrest for violating probation. It turned out that James had his own motives for stopping the dance. The woman had immediately appealed to him. After the incident at the house party, Osuna was immediately put back in prison, but he and Jane stayed in touch, writing to each other almost daily and calling each other often. They described themselves as good friends who had an age difference of 17 years. Jane explained that James was very intelligent and she enjoyed talking to him. She described him as a gentleman who liked to talk about philosophy and psychology. He was also very charming and enchanted Jane with his masculine beauty. When his release date approached, she didn't hesitate to drive to the prison to meet him. James had gotten several tattoos on his face during his incarceration, including the Joker's smile. For Jane, he was already an interesting person, and the tattoo gave him a certain mystique and uniqueness. The young woman said she never took the man seriously but just had fun with him. After they were released from prison, they went straight to a motel, paid for the night, and had fun like two adults. A few weeks later, Jane found out she was pregnant. She hadn't considered James as the father of the child at all, especially not after the tattoos he had gotten on his face. But Osuna was actually in love with Jane, and that made the woman reconsider. She decided that James might be a pretty good father and that she should try to give him a second chance. It was Jane's fourth child, and it was in her best interest to settle down, take this young man seriously, and give him a chance. When Asuna proposed to his beloved, she said yes. In February 2010, the newlyweds exchanged vows. James was 22 years old and his bride 39. Despite the age difference, the young man was very excited and happy. He participated in the wedding preparations and dreamed of becoming a father as soon as possible. However, a few days after the wedding, Jane began to understand why her husband associated himself with the Joker. She saw another side of the man, the sweet, loving young man transformed in an instant into a jealous and controlling husband who abused Jane both physically and emotionally. During her pregnancy, he behaved exactly as the men in his mother's life had behaved. After about 6 months, the Asuna couple had such a violent argument that James took the urn with the ashes of Jane's father and left the house. It was very important to the pregnant woman that her husband return the urn. She tried to call him but couldn't get through. Jane then desperately called the police, which led to James being arrested again. Unfortunately, his father's ashes were never found, and Asuna spent the next 6 months of his life behind bars, after which he was released on parole. Of course, by this time, Jane had already given birth to a son. Somehow, the convict managed to persuade his wife to give him the chance to be a good father and husband. He remembered his childhood and didn't want his child to experience anything different. James assured Jane that he had changed and things would be different now, but people rarely change, and all the changes that had taken place in Asuna's character were marked with a minus sign. He started using illegal substances again, which only increased his aggression towards his wife. Jane wanted a reaction to his actions, but Jane, knowing what her husband wanted, learned to ignore him. She practically no longer perceived what he said to her. Sometimes she still had to fight back. One night, her husband literally lost it. He broke a picture frame, grabbed a piece of glass, and cut his hand. The cut was deep. Jane was scared, especially when she realized he had cut into a vein, but James behaved like a madman. He grabbed tape, wrapped the wound, and pulled a black sock over it. He adamantly refused to go to the hospital. The next evening, the husband again began to share his displeasure with his wife. She simply ignored his words and devoted herself to her maternal duties. To get Jane's attention, James went to the bed where the woman's 7-year-old son from a previous relationship was sleeping and pushed him, looking his wife straight in the eyes, simply onto the parquet floor. Jane, unlike James' mother, did not want to let her children be hurt. She went into the kitchen, got 2 knives, and threw them at her husband. Of course, Asuna hadn't expected such a reaction. He walked away, did something stupid, and violated his probation, which led to another stay behind bars. James was released on Halloween 2011. By this time, his face was already completely covered with Joker-like tattoos, and when everyone took off their scary masks after the holidays, Asuna didn't have the chance. His mask was permanent. The man wouldn't calm down and continued to stalk his wife. He threatened her with violence, scared her that he would take her children away, and wandered under the windows of the house. Jane had to call the police almost every day, but since James took no concrete action, the officers no longer responded to the woman's requests. One day, however, everything changed. Jane recognized it immediately from James' tone of voice. Her husband wasn't just threatening to come over. He also told her to watch the news because he had killed a woman at the El Morocco motel. It was November 8, 2011. Jane called the police again, knowing that her husband was capable of going on a rampage. She explained to the dispatcher that James Asuna was a real psychopath and that he was talking about a woman he had allegedly stabbed in a motel room. She asked them to check the information as she feared the victim might need help. But the police did nothing as they considered it another provocation from Jane's deranged husband. 5 days after her phone call with James, Jane turned on the news and saw a report that an employee of the El Morocco motel had discovered the body of a woman in one of the rooms. The victim was 36-year-old Yvette Pina, a mother of 6. She was a Sunday school teacher who had recently become addicted to illegal substances, and was struggling to overcome her addiction. Yvette Pina's childhood was no less difficult than Jaime Osuna's. Her mother, Yvette, gave birth to her at the age of 15 when she was actually still a child herself. Growing up, Yvette had to run the household and take care of her younger sister, Danielle, who suffered from a congenital disease. Her mother worked constantly, spent time with her boyfriend, and only came home in the evenings. Due to this neglect, both girls were abused by their mother's boyfriend. But even that didn't make the woman worry about her daughter's well-being. She didn't believe Yvette's words and thought she was just looking for attention. Yvette couldn't cope with the painful experience. She started drinking alcohol to hide her pain. At the age of 16, Yvette gave birth to a son. At first, everything went well. She had several more children, but in 2004, she started taking psychostimulants and her life went downhill. Soon, Pina lost custody of her children. In 2011, Yvette was arrested for possession of illegal substances and gave birth to her sixth child in prison. It was immediately taken away from her, which was another blow for the woman. So Yvette turned to her sister for help. The younger Danielle bailed her out. After her release, Pina did everything she could to get her baby back. The baby was in the neonatal intensive care unit, and Yvette went to the hospital every day to see it. She stayed clean for several months. But one day she learned that the baby was to be adopted, and this news sent Yvette into a stupor. She snapped and now spent most of her time at the El Morocco motel because she could no longer pay the rent for her house. Then on November 13, 2011, Danielle received the news that her sister had been found dead in her motel room. Due to the severity of the injuries and the fact that the body lay in a room for several days after her death, it was decided to cremate Yvette Pina. Relatives could not see her mutilated remains. According to experts, the woman had been lying there for about 5 days. The medical examiner determined that Pina died from blunt force trauma and asphyxiation. The prosecution described what the perpetrator had done to her as something truly horrific and did not go into further detail. At that moment, the police became aware of Jane's call. They spoke to Mrs. Osuna again, who told them about the call from her crazy husband. When Jaime was brought in for questioning at his grandparents' house after his arrest, the man denied everything. If he had said something like that to Jane, it was only to scare her. Osuna then began to accuse his wife to undermine her trust in him. He questioned Jane's decision to marry him and asked the officers, "Why would a grown woman marry a man like me?" Then he claimed his wife was crazy and wanted to slander him. Jaime continued to talk at length about his wife. The investigators listening to his monologue noticed one thing. Yvette Pina bore a resemblance to Jane, and when the arrested man was pointed this out, he confirmed that the women indeed looked alike. So perhaps that was the main motive for the crime. It is possible that Osuna decided to take out his feelings and contempt for Jane on a similar woman. After this assumption, Jaime refused to speak to the police at all. He was taken into custody and brought to the county jail. But even from prison, Osuna continued to stalk Jane. He called Child Protective Services several times trying to get her children taken away. When she blocked his number, he began to harass her through acquaintances. Once, he sent his wife a package with a dead rat in the mail. The man kept telling Jane that she wasn't safe if he was in prison. Once, he was caught trying to organize retaliation against his own wife. He was caught passing a letter to another prisoner. The letter contained Jane's address and instructions on how to get rid of her. Once, Mrs. Osuna actually ended up behind bars after her son told someone his mother had hit him. It is not known if this was actually the case or if the father had somehow encouraged his son to tell a lie. When Jane was being taken to court in a prison bus, she was attacked by another inmate. It later turned out that Osuna had instigated the Latina to commit a crime against his wife in exchange for illegal substances. The guards managed to separate the women before either of them was injured. The charges against Jane were eventually dropped, and she regained custody of her youngest child, son James. However, this also affected her other children who were given to their biological fathers. Osuna also ruined his spouse's life and still got away with it. While awaiting trial in prison, James admitted that he had seen Yvette on November 13, but she was still alive. What happened to her after that, he does not know. Osuna publicly expressed his hope that the Peña family would soon find the real villain. He did not admit his guilt, even when he was told that Yvette Peña had already been dead for 5 days on November 13, and therefore he could not possibly have seen her. But James stuck to his story. Osuna said that people came to the motel to buy and use illegal substances, and that the rooms at the El Morocco were intended for intimate services. The man even gave the authorities the names of other people who were there and might have had something to do with Yvette's death. James was denied bail, so he remained behind bars. His trial was postponed so many times that he eventually spent 6 years in prison without a conviction. The date for the start of the trial was set for March 27, 2017, but before that, on March 24, Osuna gave an interview to a journalist and shocked her with his candor. By this time, his entire face was covered with tattoos, and James looked like the real villain he was. Osuna called himself the Joker and the man with 1,000 faces. He constantly added new tattoos that made him almost unrecognizable. Each new tattoo changed his appearance, sometimes subtly, sometimes drastically. The difference between his current appearance and that of 10 years ago was striking. The reporter sat only a few feet away from the criminal and couldn't take her eyes off his face. She listened as James told her the gruesome details of the massacre of Yvette Peña at the El Morocco motel. The journalist said the information was so disturbing that she didn't dare to reveal it because she didn't want the deceased's family to live with the pain of learning about it. Osuna pleaded guilty to all charges against him. He enjoyed what he experienced when he took the woman's life. If he got the chance, he wouldn't hesitate to do it again. If he were ever released, he would reoffend and take another life. James compared the massacre to using illegal substances to addiction. He would rather kill someone than spend the night with the most beautiful woman in the world. Osuna also confessed to the reporter that Yvette Peña was not his first victim. There are a few other people who have suffered at his hand, but since he cleaned the crime scene well, no one can ever connect these victims to him. In Yvette's case, James left his fingerprints and DNA at the crime scene, which led to him. That was his intention. Osuna himself wanted to be caught because he no longer wanted to be part of society. The prisoner didn't mind spending the rest of his days in prison. The only thing he feared was the death penalty, but for that case, he had thought of everything. His plan was to appear in court, change his plea, and use the 2 other offenses that the police knew nothing about as leverage. That way, he could ensure he wouldn't be sentenced to death. The correspondent tried to get more information from the prisoner about the other 2 offenses. Osuna, however, only mentioned casually that one victim was a 27-year-old man whom he had brought to his grave. The other was a 32-year-old woman whom James encountered when he was 18 years old. On the question about any remorse, Osuna laughed and said that he felt no remorse. This man did not consider himself a monster. He just was not afraid to indulge his own desires without being influenced by society. James believes that he made himself who he is and is aware of the consequences that await him, but he does not regret it. He stressed that he would not enter into any deals to save the Peña family from a prolonged trial where heinous photographs would be shown. He simply preferred to go to prison rather than wait several more years for a trial. After this conversation, the reporter did not leave us for a long time. She did not know whether to contact the prosecutor with the information she received from Osuna or let things take their course. In the end, she decided to wait for the trial and see what happened. As promised, James pleaded guilty during the process to avoid the death penalty. His plan worked. Thanks to this plan, the family did not see the shocking photos of Yvette's body and did not learn in full detail how she died. The prosecutor had to accept this as he believed it would be difficult for the family to hear all the horror. Yvette Pina's sister asked the judge to set the sentencing for May 15, 2017. On that day, the deceased would have had her birthday. Yvette would have turned 42 if Osuna hadn't met her on her way. Neither the judge nor the lawyers for either side objected, and so James was sentenced that day to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Members of Yvette's family were in the audience when Osuna appeared in the courtroom. He smiled broadly at them and waved his hand. This was perceived by all present as a mockery of the victim's family. During his incarceration at the State Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, James often wrote something in blood on the walls of his cell. Osuna was later transferred to Corcoran State Prison in California. There, the 31-year-old criminal was considered particularly dangerous and violent, and attempts were made to keep him in solitary confinement. James, however, managed to sneak into an adjacent cell and mutilate another inmate's face. As a result of the attack, the man had to be stitched up with 67 stitches. On March 9, 2019, 2 years after his conviction, the real Joker made national media headlines again. He brutally took the life of his cellmate, an inmate named Luis Romero. The 44-year-old Romero was convicted for his part in a massacre. As a teenager, he was a member of a gang involved in a deadly attack. Luis spent 27 years in prison and was soon to be released on parole. For some reason, the man was placed in the cell where Osuna lived. A few days after his transfer, he was found decapitated and disemboweled. James had hung his body on the cell wall as a gruesome decoration. For the massacre, he used a razor blade from which he fashioned a knife by wrapping a piece of cloth around the handle. He gouged out Romero's eye, severed a finger, tore out some ribs and a piece of lung, decapitated his cellmate, and slit his mouth from ear to create the infamous Joker smile. While doing so, he made several photos of the mutilated body which were later confiscated. When the guards came for the morning check, James appeared with a necklace of ropes from which hung a part of Luis' body. The motive for Osuna's actions was completely unclear. There was no conflict between the two prisoners. They had been living in the same cell for about 2 days. James Osuna was known as a very unpredictable and cruel person. He was classified as an extremely dangerous prisoner. Luis's family was extremely distressed that Romero had to share a cell with the madman shortly before his release. Many staff members at the institution were genuinely afraid of Osuna. Other inmates called him crazy. In James' file, it stated that he should limit contact with other inmates and prison staff. He had always been kept in solitary confinement, and before Luis Romero, James had never had cellmates because he was considered so dangerous. James was transferred to Stockton Prison, which houses inmates requiring medical or psychiatric help. In March 2021, he was deemed insane and incapable of taking responsibility for his actions. Since then, he has been diagnosed with a schizophrenic spectrum disorder. James' ex-wife Jane divorced him. After losing custody of her children and the destructive relationship with James, she had to undergo several psychotherapy sessions. Jane often wondered why her husband directed his anger and aggression at Yvette Pina, a woman who had much in common with her. She felt very guilty towards the children who had lost their mother in such a terrible way. Mrs. Osuna knew that she was the one towards whom James felt hostility and wanted to do the same, but for some reason hurt another person. Now the woman is doing her best to move on. She doesn't want her and her son to be associated in any way with the real Joker. Jane is tired of the media attention and wants to live a quiet, peaceful life. James Osuna has recently been suffering increasingly from paranoia but refuses to take his medication, leave his cell, or speak to a psychiatrist. He constantly talks about his fear that someone is setting him up and complains incessantly. James' mother, Michelle, has publicly expressed her feelings. The woman explained that she should trade places with her son. In her opinion, what happened is the result of a difficult childhood. Michelle didn't stand up for him when she should have and was too afraid to stand up for her son. Her son had transformed from a gentle, sweet boy into a vicious monster, but he wasn't born that way. Thank you for watching and take care of yourselves.